Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we're telling The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope, published in the year 1894. An Englishman travels to a small kingdom in the heart of Europe, and there falls into the greatest adventure of his life. A story about two faces that resemble each other like mirror images, about a crown that sits on the wrong head, and about a love that is not permitted to be. Make yourself comfortable. Breathe calmly, and let yourself be carried to rewritten, into a land of forests, castles, and old secrets. My name is Rudolf Rassendyll, and my sister-in-law Rose used to say that I was the most useless man in all of England. Perhaps she was right. I was 29 years old, possessed enough of a fortune not to have to work, spoke several languages, fenced tolerably, rode well, and shot better, and with all of that had never taken up anything serious. At a breakfast table in my brother's house began the story I am telling here, and it began with my hair. For I have dark red hair and a long, straight nose, and both are unusual in my family. Yet both recur generation after generation in individual Rassendylls, and whoever knows the family history knows why. More than 100 years ago, a prince from the distant kingdom of Ruritania visited the English court, and between him and a married Countess Rassendyll, there arose a story that was not gladly spoken of in the family. Ever since, the red hair of the Elfbergs, the Ruritanian royal house, turns up among us from time to time, like a memory that will not be shaken off. Rose found it scandalous. I found it entertaining. And when I read in the newspaper that in Ruritania a new king was to be crowned in a few weeks, Rudolph V, a man of my age and, so it was said, with the same red hair, I resolved to go and see this spectacle. To my family I said I wished to go to the Tyrol, to hike. It was the first lie of this story, and it did not remain the last. I traveled by way of Paris and Dresden, and at last boarded the train that rolled through the forests of Ruritania down into the little town of Zenda, which lies on the great road to the capital. Above the town, on a crag, rises the old castle. Behind it, the newer chateau, both in the possession of Duke Michael of Strelzow, the half-brother of the future king. I took a room at the inn, and over supper the landlady told what occupied the whole country. That the new king was little known to the people, that he preferred to spend his days with wine and hunting, and that many quietly saw Duke Michael on the throne, who lived here among the people, and whom one knew. 2 days before the coronation, so it was said, the king was hunting in the game park of Zenda, a guest at the duke's hunting lodge. I resolved to walk the next day through that very forest. The forest of Zenda was still and green, and I hiked half the day, ate my bread by a brook, and afterward lay down in the moss to sleep. When I woke, 2 men stood over me and stared at me as though I were a ghost. The one was old, broad, and weather-beaten, with a gray mustache and eyes accustomed to command. Colonel Sapt, as I soon learned. The other was young, slender, and courteous, Fritz von Tarlenheim. Both served the king. They stared, and then I heard a laugh behind them, and from among the trees stepped a third man, and it was as though I looked into a mirror. My face, my nose, my hair, my height. There stood I myself, only a little fuller, and with a line about the mouth that told of too many good evenings. It was the King of Ruritania. He laughed first, came toward me, and cried that this must be celebrated, a cousin from England, for that I was one he guessed at first glance. The family history was well known to him, and amused him royally. He took me with him to the hunting lodge, and we dined and drank into the evening, and the king drank the most. Sapt sat there like a thundercloud, for the coronation was in Strelzow the morning after next, and his master was carousing as though nothing lay before him but another day's hunting. Late in the evening a servant brought a last bottle, a gift from Duke Michael with the brothers' greetings. The king laughed, praised Michael's goodwill, and drank the bottle alone, down to the last drop. The rest of us had had enough. I fell asleep the moment I lay down. When I woke, it was broad morning, and over me stood Sapt with a face I shall never forget. The king could not be woken. He lay as though dead, his breath came heavily, no shaking, no cold water, nothing brought him up. In the brothers' wine there had been a sleeping draught, strong enough to blot out a man for a day and a night. And in a few hours, in the cathedral of Strelsau, the country waited for his coronation. Sapt spoke it first, and he spoke it while looking at me. If the king did not appear today, he would never be crowned. Michael would sit on the throne in the course of the day. That he would see to. Everything was arranged for it, and the draught from the bottle had been the first move of the game. Unless, said Sapt, and his voice grew quite calm, unless another rode to Strelsau and let himself be crowned. A man with the king's face. I took it at first for madness, and I said so. Sapt let me finish and then set out his reasons, short and hard as hammer blows. The coronation could not be postponed. Every delay was Michael's victory. No one in Strelsau knew the king closely. He had lived far from the capital. The resemblance between us had deceived 3 men the evening before who saw him daily before we ever stood side by side. It was a matter of one day. Coronation, procession, an evening at the palace, then, in the night, we would ride back, fetch the rested king, and get me over the border. Fritz was pale and said nothing. I thought of my life, which up to this morning had consisted of well-tempered uselessness, and heard myself say that I would do it. Sapt fetched the razor. My beard fell, for the king wore none, and with every stroke of the blade, the traveler Rassendyll became something else. The sleeping king we carried into the wine cellar of the hunting lodge, where old Joseph, the servant, was to guard him, faithful as a dog. Then we rode, 3 men in the dawn, to Strelsau. What came then I lived through like a dream, in which one knows one is dreaming and yet cannot wake. The streets of the capital full of people, flags at every window, and I in the midst of it, waving, greeting, with a smile that froze on my face. In the cathedral, the archbishop, the gold, the singing, the weight of the crown upon my head, and I spoke the oaths of a king. I, Rudolf Rassendyll of England. And the people outside cried the name that was almost mine. 2 encounters from that day have stayed with me. The first, Duke Michael, who came toward me in the cathedral to pay homage. He was dark, as his mother must have been, a handsome, somber man, and when he saw my face, healthy, awake, crowned, I saw something work in his eyes that he held down with all his strength. He knew what had been in the bottle. He did not grasp whom he had before him, but he grasped that his game had failed and had to smile and bow before all the world. The second encounter was Princess Flavia. She rode beside me in the procession, red gold hair, a calm, clear face, and the people loved her and cried her name beside mine, for all the world expected that the king would marry her. She looked at me from the side and said I was changed, graver, more awake than she remembered me. It pleased her. I was silent, as well as a king can be silent. In the night, Sapt and I rode back to the hunting lodge to fetch the true king. We found the cellar door open. Inside lay old Joseph, dead, struck down. The king was gone. We stood in that cellar, Sapt and I, and the floor seemed to sway beneath us. Michael's men had come in the night, had found the sleeping king and carried him off, and faithful Joseph had paid for it with his life. Now Michael possessed the king, and yet could do nothing with him without betraying himself. For in Strelsau the king had been crowned before the eyes of the country. If Michael now cried to the world that the crowned man was an impostor and the true king lay in his power, he had to explain how his brother had come there. That was the situation, and Zapt spoke it aloud on the ride home, grim and low. "We are caught in the trap, but Michael is caught in it with us. I could not leave, for if the king vanished now, the country belonged to the duke. I had to go on playing, day after day, until we had freed the prisoner. So began my life as king of Ruritania. I learned to sign papers whose contents Zapt whispered to me. I received ministers and envoys. I rode through the streets and grew accustomed to waving. And the strange thing was, the country began to like this new king. He did not drink. He listened. He was kind to humble people. I did what I could, and sometimes, in quiet minutes, I was frightened at how easy it came to me. Soon, we also knew where the true king was, in the castle of Zenda, in the old masonry above the crag, behind walls and a moat, guarded by Michael's confidants. 6 men the duke kept for his dark business. In the country, they were called simply the 6, and the most dangerous of them was at the same time the youngest. Rupert of Hentzau, barely 23, handsome as the morning and without any conscience. A man who lied laughing and killed laughing, and to whom life was one single glittering game. I came to know him early enough, and something else happened in these weeks that I had not willed and could not stop. I saw Flavia almost daily, at feasts, at audiences, on drives, and out of the courteous side-by-side grew a conversation neither of us wished to end, and out of the conversation grew more. She had never loved the king. The country knew it. She herself had never hidden it. But this new man, who wore the king's face and not the king's soul, him she began to love. And I should have stayed cold for the sake of the true king, for her sake. I did not stay cold. I loved her from the first day, and every evening on which I took her hand as king was happiness and betrayal in one. Michael drew the noose tight in his way, silently. An open attack on me was barred to him, for if he killed the false king, he made public the deception that he himself knew best, and the true king in his dungeon thereby became worthless. So he sent the 6. It began with an invitation to a hunt, which I declined at Zapt's urging. The tea I would have been served there would likely have been my last. Then came the night when I sat in my dressing room and heard a sound at the window, and only Zapt's mistrust, which had long since infected me, saved my life. I threw myself aside, and the knife drove into the back of the chair. The man escaped through the garden. I began to understand that in Strelzow I was no safer than the prisoner in Zenda, only that my cage looked larger. We resolved to turn the tables. The court moved, so it was said, to summer at Tarlenheim, the estate of Fritz's family, which happened to lie near Zenda. From there, under the pretext of hunts and country outings, we reconnoitered the castle. It was a hard piece of work. The new chateau in front, behind it, connected by a drawbridge, the old keep above the moat, and in this keep, behind an iron-bound door, sat the king. A peasant from the village, whose mother Zapt knew, described the guards and the habits of the house to us. And Michael's answer to our nearness did not keep us waiting. One evening, as I rode alone with Fritz through the forest, 3 riders broke from the thicket, and it was no courteous game. We escaped with our lives, Fritz with a slash across the arm, and when the 3 saw that we had been on our guard, they withdrew, and their leader took off his hat and bowed in the saddle, laughing with flashing teeth. That was my first encounter with Rupert of Hentzau on the open stage. A few days later, he even came to me, as the Duke's negotiator, with an offer that surpassed everything in insolence. Safe conduct and 1,000,000 crowns if I would vanish and confess the deception. I refused, as he had expected, and he chatted a while longer, charming as a summer's day, sizing me up, meanwhile, as a fencer does his opponent, and at parting, already in the saddle, he leaned down and said softly that it was a pity we were enemies, for in truth, he and I were the only men in this country who understood life. Then he gave his horse the spur. I looked after him and understood that this young man was more dangerous than the Duke and the other 5 together. In these days, a message reached me that no one had reckoned with. It came from a woman, Antoinette de Maubon, a beautiful Parisian of fortune who had followed the Duke to Ruritania out of love and lived at the castle. She loved Michael, and for that very reason she wrote to me. For Michael was planning, so she warned, to lure me into a trap, a feigned meeting, an ambush, and she did not want murder done on her account, and above all, did not want Michael to become king through a murder and then leave her to marry Flavia. From this tangled, desperate source flowed our best knowledge. She also described to us the dungeon and the provision Michael had made for the utmost case, and this provision was devilish. The king's cell lay in the keep, right at the water, and from it a broad pipe led through the wall down into the moat. The people called it Jacob's Ladder. If the castle were attacked, the guards inside had orders to kill the king on the spot, thrust the body through the pipe into the moat, and afterward swear that the prisoner had escaped. An assault on the castle would thus destroy the very thing it was meant to save. There was only one way: cunning, a small party, and someone who beforehand swam unnoticed through the moat and watched the pipe. We prepared everything, 10 reliable men, a moonless night. And then, on the afternoon before the planned stroke, everything was overturned, for a messenger brought news from the castle. The king was ill. The imprisonment, the damp, the despair had cast him down. He was in fever, and if he died in there, then everything died with him. Then there was no king to save, only an impostor on the throne and a duke who knew the truth. Zapt looked at me long that evening, and I knew what he was thinking, and he knew that I knew. If the king, through his own weakness, stayed away forever, then the false king could simply go on ruling, marry Flavia, govern the country, govern it well. No one would ever learn a thing. Zapt did not speak it aloud, and I did not answer it. But that night I lay awake and fought the stillest and hardest battle of this whole story, and the opponent was myself. In the morning it stood firm, as it had to stand firm. We would attack as soon as it was dark. The king had to come out, alive, cost what it might. The night was black, and the moat was cold. I slid into the water first, for the pipe, Jacob's Ladder, was my post, while Zapt with the men waited at the gate for the signal. I swam soundlessly along the wall and kept to the shadow of the keep, close beside the broad pipe, and above me, behind the barred window, a light burned. The king's cell. What happened then, none of us had planned, and it came from within the castle itself. Rupert of Hentzau, to whom nothing was sacred, had raised his eyes to Antoinette de Maubon, his master's beloved, and that night he broke into her chambers. Her scream tore the castle from sleep. Michael rushed up, and the 2 men, the Duke and his best blade, went at each other with bared swords. The din of the fight echoed across the courtyard, Doors slammed, lights flew through the windows, and in this tumult died Michael, the Black Duke, by the hand of his own man. But for me, only one thing counted. Inside the keep, the guards would now be thinking of their orders. I climbed out of the water, and how I came into the castle, through which door, up which stair, I know to this day only in pictures. A passage, a lamp, a man who threw himself at me and fell. Then I stood in the cell. The king lay on his cot, wretched, gray, barely conscious, and over him stood Detchard, the coldest of the six, his sword already raised for the death stroke. The doctor who had been left with the sick man threw himself between and died in my place a heartbeat too soon, and then our blades crossed, Detchard's and mine, in this narrow, stony room over the tiles that were slick with the water of the moat. He was the best fencer I ever stood against, save one. I do not know how long it lasted. In the end, Detchard lay still, and I knelt beside the king, who looked up at me with feverish eyes into my face, which was his face, and whispered whether he was dreaming. Outside the drawbridge thundered down, zapped, and our men stormed the castle, and the resistance collapsed, for the Duke was dead, and the six were shattered. Only one was missing. I stepped out onto the bridge, and below in the courtyard sat Rupert of Hentzau on horseback, surrounded and yet not to be seized. And when he saw me, he laughed, saluted with his sword as in the fencing hall, spurred through the ranks, leaped over the parapet into the water of the moat, and was gone, into the forest, into the darkness, unharmed and laughing to the last. I never saw him again. Behind me, in the castle of Zenda, lay my king, saved, and with his rescue, my own death sentence was pronounced. Rudolf Rassendyll had ceased to be necessary. The king recovered. He lay for weeks yet at Zenda, and the country was told a story that could be told, of an attempt by the dead duke, of the loyalty of Colonel Sapt, of the king's captivity and his rescue. My name did not appear in it, and my face vanished from Ruritania as it had come, quietly, by night. But before that, 2 farewells lay before me, and they were the hardest part of this whole story, harder than the moat and the blades. The first was the farewell from the king. He knew everything by now, and he received me at his sickbed, took my hand, and said I had given him more than his life. I had shown him how one is a king. He said it without bitterness, but we both knew that between us stood something that could never be cleared away. I had worn his crown, and it had fit me. The second farewell was Flavia. She now likewise knew the truth. She had learned it on the night of Zenda, and when we stood facing each other for the last time, alone, in a still room, everything lay open between us, that I was not the king, that I loved her, that she loved me, Rudolf Rassendyll, the man, not the crown. I did not ask her to come with me. I knew she could not, and she knew that I knew it. She was an Elfberg. Her name belonged to the country, and the country needed its queen. Honor, she said softly, was not what the heart wanted, but what it bound. She drew a ring from her finger and gave it to me, and I gave her a rose, which she took to herself. And then I went, and behind me the door closed, and I stood in the corridor of a strange castle, and was nobody again. Sapt and Fritz brought me to the border in the dawn. The old colonel pressed my hand and said he had seen many a king come and go, but only one whom he had chosen himself. Then my train departed. I have lived in England ever since. My brother thinks me matured. My sister-in-law thinks me improved, and neither knows of what. I never married. Once a year, however, a messenger comes to me from Ruritania, from Fritz, and brings a box, and in it lies a rose. and with the rose a note on which stand 3 words: Rudolph, Flavia, always. And once a year I send the same message back. They say I am a man who has come to nothing, but in one summer of my life I was a king, and a queen loved me. And when I sit by the fire in the evening, I sometimes think that no life is wasted that contains such a summer. That was our short retelling of The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope. A man lends a king his face, and in the end gives everything back, the crown and the love, and keeps only 1 rose a year. Some loyalty shows itself in the keeping, the greatest in the letting go. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.